Hi, my name is Sarah Dockeray and I'm a librarian at Valencia College. The goal of this video is to give you some criteria you can use to evaluate research sources to determine if they're credible. We're used to using research sources and reading news sources in our daily lives, but we don't often put a lot of thought into how credible they are, how trustworthy the source is. When we're doing an assignment in college, that is far more important. It's important in both places, but your grade depends on how credible the sources are that you're using in your research. So we're going to talk about 5 evaluation criteria that you can use whenever you look for a research source to determine if it's strong enough to use in an academic assignment. The first thing you'll look for is the authority. So really that just means you're looking for a named author. In addition to the author's name, there should be some credentials provided. So do the credentials make the author an expert? Think about what makes someone an expert. Usually it's going to be a mix of education and job history. Also, you may find websites that don't have a person's name, but maybe an organization or company. So think about them as well. Would they be an expert in the field that you're researching? When you're looking for an author, you can also see what else they write about. So one easy tip to figure out this portion of the criteria is to look for an About Me or About Us section of a site. Sometimes in an article, the author's name will be highlighted and you can click on their name and find a short biography. Occasionally at the end of an article, there may be 1 or 2 sentences that tells you who the author is. So basically you want to make sure that your author has some kind of experience and background in the field that they're writing about. The next piece you'll look at is the accuracy. How can you tell that the information in the source is accurate? One of the easiest ways to figure that out is just like you have to provide citations for your research, authors do as well. Even if the person is established as an expert, they still need to show you where their research came from. So in some sources, there may be citations throughout the article, or perhaps a bibliography or references page at the end of the article. Some more scholarly sources, like library accessed journal articles, may be peer-reviewed. That means that an anonymous panel of experts in the same field will read an article before it's published to determine how accurate it is. Was research done properly? If the research involves people or animals, was it done ethically? Things like that. When it's a website, you can think about looking for errors in spelling or grammar that might indicate that the person is not as professional as they're telling you they are. And as you're doing your research as a whole, be sure that some of the information is shared among other sources. So clearly all of your sources are going to have different information, otherwise you would only need one source, but you want to make sure that some of the information that overlaps is the same, it's similar. The next piece to look for is the currency. So this is really about making sure that you're using up-to-date research and information. So when you're thinking about books, or it could be magazine or journal articles, you want to look for the material's published date. For a website, you may find a published date. It may also tell you when the page was last edited or updated. Think about the style if it's a website. Does it look outdated? Are a lot of the links broken? Things like that. Now, we say that currency is important, but it's really going to depend how important on the kind of research that you're doing. So if you're researching a current event, a popular topic, if you're looking for statistics or data, you want to use the most recent sources as possible. However, if you're looking for background information, a definition, maybe some historical perspective, it may not be the most up-to-date source out there. When you go to search for materials, you can also think about the timelines in which things are currently published, and that can help you figure out where to start. For example, a book may take a year or more to actually write. Then it goes through an editing process, and then it has to be actually printed. A librarian has to find it, purchase it for the library, and so on and so forth. So sometimes books don't end up on the shelf at the library until they're already 2 or 3 years old. So for that purpose, we tend to think of books as being good for background information, an overview, could be a timeline, or a list of important people close to an event, but we are probably not going to look for statistics from a book. Now, the next length would be a magazine article. It could also be a library, scholarly journal article. Those usually take anywhere from 1 month to 6 months to be published. So if it's a scholarly journal article and it's research-based, clearly it's going to take some time to do the research. If it's a magazine article, it's not as scholarly, but it also is not published every single day. Usually a magazine will come out once a month. And then finally, we have sources like newspapers or websites, which can be created almost immediately, or at least the next day. So we can get the most up-to-date information from sources like newspapers, but they're not necessarily as credible as, say, a journal article, because we've had time to think about, evaluate, research, and study the material that first came out, say, in a newspaper article, to draw some bigger conclusions through research. So a good essay will use a balance of all different kinds of sources, not just books or not just newspaper articles. When you're thinking about the source, you also want to try to figure out what the author's purpose is. So this deals really with looking for any possible bias. So you can look at why the material is written. Was it to inform or to be educational? Or is the person trying to sell you something, to make you laugh, or maybe even change your point of view on a topic? Is the author presenting different perspectives, or are they only showing one side of the subject they're writing about? If it's a website that we're talking about and it's hosted by a professional organization, do they have any possible political, religious, or cultural biases? And really the bottom line is that if the material is biased, is it still helpful to you? And that's going to depend. If you're writing a persuasive essay, biased information may be helpful for you to prove a point, but if you're trying to be informative and remain neutral in the tone, it's best to avoid any kind of biased information. Biased information isn't necessarily false or incorrect, it's just that it will tend to only portray or present the side of evidence that looks best to their point of view. So we want someone who is neutral and is presenting both perspectives on a topic instead of a very narrow view. And then we come to relevancy. Relevancy kind of ties everything up in a nice bow at the end. So this is really thinking about if the material is the best fit for you. Relevancy doesn't necessarily make a source credible, but it helps you decide what's best. So as you're looking at research sources, think about the audience that the material is directed towards. Is it a general audience? That would be like a magazine. Anyone at the supermarket can pick up a magazine and read it. Or is it scholarly? Some information is professional, and while that is the most scholarly you can get, it can also be pretty hard to understand as a student. Often when you look for scholarly journal articles through the library, Because they involve original research, they will cover a very specific time period, geographic area, or demographic of society. So before using a study like that in your research, ask, is that appropriate for the topic that you're covering? Based on your topic, you can also ask yourself if the information is too basic. So is it encyclopedic information with definitions? Or maybe it's too technical or clinical, again, difficult for a student or an average person to understand. Then you also want to think about the assignment itself. Is the material appropriate for your topic? So let's say it's a discussion board post. Maybe a website is okay. But if we're writing a 7-page essay, then we need to make sure that we're using more scholarly sources. So at this point you may be asking yourself, okay, scholarly sources, what does that mean? There are 3 primary kinds of sources that you'll find, and these are all present in the library. So you can see the difference between using a scholarly journal or a popular source, which would be like a newspaper or a magazine. While they're helpful and they do contain information, popular sources usually aren't written by experts. It's second or third hand information that they've read from an expert. But it can also be difficult to understand because it's not only by experts but for experts. Usually the length is going to be very long, the language is technical, but you shouldn't find any kind of advertising. But you should find lots and lots of citations throughout the article and at the end. Now, in between scholarly and popular sources is one source you may not be familiar with, and that is called a trade publication. It's kind of like a magazine by experts for experts. So the articles don't tend to be as long. However, they are still technical and have credible professional information in them. So a trade publication might be a great middle ground if you're doing scholarly research and on your topic it's just too heavy. You're struggling to understand the information. So I hope that this will help you pick the most credible sources that you can. I don't expect you to have a checklist that you check off on every single website you visit, but it's helpful to remember some of this criteria. If you go to a website and there's no author listed, try to find a new one. If you can't find a publish date on data, we don't know how old it could be, try to find a new one. Good luck on your research!